Hi, and welcome to Drones for Good from Modus, where we chat to industry insiders about how drones, LiDAR, mapping, and geospatial technology are changing the world around us. Today, we're in Switzerland to speak with Ulrich Amberg, who is the CEO of SwissDrones. Ulrich, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, hi, Claire, and thanks for having me.
No worries. Thank you for being here. How is the weather in Switzerland today?
Brilliant, actually. It's very sunny. It's almost getting towards summer here.
Nice. Okay. Well, listen, let's get straight into it because I am very interested to hear about what SwissDrones actually does.
Well, happy to talk about this. So SwissDrones is by now actually a leading manufacturer and also an operator of long-range unmanned helicopter systems. We enable safe and cost-effective unmanned aerial intelligence solutions for mainly surveillance, inspection, and search and rescue missions beyond visual line of sight, which means for long-range missions. And we're talking about 50 or 100 miles of a flight distance covered in that case.
So why would people use these unmanned helicopters as opposed to manned ones? Explain the differences and the advantages.
So, as we all know, many of these missions, particularly these, safety critical missions, are being performed with manned helicopters for a very long time already. And they are inherently dangerous. So there is accidents all the time, unfortunately, with casualties. When we talk about things like power line inspections, it's inherently very dangerous. So you fly low, you fly in close proximity to the infrastructure. And there is an obvious risk, and unfortunately, these accidents happen every now and then. Then, of course, it's costly. So deploying a manned helicopter, which can be a 3-ton piece of equipment just flying around for literally sensors and camera gear, not to transport goods or people, is not a very effective way of doing these things if you do have an alternative option to accomplish the same task. Last but not least, there is a lot of carbon emissions coming from the use of manned choppers. So you're talking about 200 liters of fuel an hour. Not sure what that is in gallons in the US, but it's a lot of fuel. And we're reducing that by more than 90% as well, which becomes an increasing concern of many utility companies, energy companies, oil and gas as an industry. So everybody is trying to reduce carbon emissions to the minimum possible, and saving more than 90% in emissions and fuel is obviously quite a huge step forward.
Wow, so quite a lot greener than these unmanned helicopters as opposed to the traditional manned versions. But tell me a little bit more about your products. Discuss, what it is that you offer.
So we do have, it's actually a platform like on many drones. So we're just a bit bigger than the typical, what everybody would consider a drone normally. So it's 3 meters or like almost 10-foot wide aircraft. It's actually an aircraft. It's not so much a toy or a small scale drone. It's also regulated very similarly to aircraft. It's about 200 pounds of a takeoff weight. It can carry payloads up to practically, like the useful payload would go up to 40 pounds, including fuel. It's like almost 90 pounds in total. And it can go on for like dozens of miles per flight. So we're talking about flight endurance of multiple hours. So this is really made to replace manned aircraft. So we're, in that sense, with the product, we're bridging the gap between manned aircraft on this side and the small scale drones that are usually being deployed today in drone operations in many of these limited range applications, obviously, but we're kind of bridging the gap between these two ends.
Let's see more detail about some of the situations that your unmanned helicopters are deployed in.
So when we're talking about the 3 main verticals we serve, one is public safety, and that means typically law enforcement, Coast Guard applications, border control applications. So this is the typical real-time aerial intelligence gathering. So as you would see in police helicopters and the like, you fly for extended periods of times. in extended ranges of an area, and you want to get aerial intelligence real time. The same goes for first responders or incident management procedures, such as in wildfire fighting. And again, it's always the same pattern there. You have dangerous missions, so flying over a wildfire is not something you want to do with manned aircraft if you can avoid it. But it still does the same thing. So it provides real-time aerial intelligence. Given the large payload weights, you can actually deploy pretty much the same types of sensors that you would in a manned aircraft. Then, well, and a variant of that is search and rescues that obviously goes along with public safety applications to some extent. That's mainly a topic for maritime applications with coast guards that, again, replace the manned helicopters. In that case, even bigger ones, because flying offshore or over the ocean is typically require even bigger helicopters, twin engine helicopters, yet more expensive, more fuel consuming, but we can do the same tasks. So finding missing boats, missing people in the water or on land, day and night, without risking crews, and of course with then reducing these emissions and costs. And then the third vertical that we're very active in is inspection, so-called long linear inspections of critical infrastructure. That's mainly power lines, pipelines. In future might extend into railways as well. And that is a very established market for manned helicopters. So we're, in that sense, really disrupting that conventional way of doing these inspections.
Rick, you mentioned sustainability and safety, but talk to me about cost savings. You know, how much do these unmanned helicopters save you in relation to the traditional manned helicopters?
One aspect is, of course, just the simple cost of the unit when you compare it to a manned helicopter. Depending on the application and the type of helicopter you look at, the procurement cost of the unit as such is already down by a factor of 6 to 8. Then the maintenance cost, like the power by the hour, as it's called in the manned helicopter world, obviously is less expensive as well, because there is less parts to be replaced and less costly parts to be replaced by the hour. Then in terms of the operation as such, you have, of course, you still need operators on the ground, and you can't do it without people. But in total, you would end up with something like a third, depending on the use case, maybe a quarter of the total costs of operation you would assume with a manned helicopter operation.
Curious to ask you how easy these are to use compared to like your traditional smaller drones.
So this is, of course, as I said initially, it's a regulated industry, and we're not operating in a freestyle environment here. In the end, there is only one sky, and there is public airspace. You need to comply with all the rules, and particularly in the US, there is still a lot of hesitance and a lot of scrutiny by the regulator to allow these things. We're very far in that progress, so we're probably going to be among the first, if not the first, commercial drone manufacturers in that category, which means beyond 55 pounds of takeoff weight, which is no longer a Part 107 approval of the FAA, but it's actually an exemption for that type of operation. We're already working on that for almost 2 years with the FAA now to get the actual approval. So the aircraft is already there and will be deployed in the US as soon as we get the final approval. So it's hopefully going to happen in the coming month. In other geographies, we do have approvals. So that is also breaking up. We're looking at an era of unmanned commercial drone applications in this category, which is pretty much at the tipping point now. Which I think, looking at this from an aviation history perspective, is quite mind-blowing, because that's actually going to be real now. And I mean, we're talking in comparison about unmanned or let's say self-driving cars for a long time. I think we will still wait for a couple of years before we see them in a city. actually driving on their own all over the place and carrying passengers. So in the unmanned aviation, we're actually there, not just for the smaller drones, but for this type of gear. Needless to say, it's not a simple thing. So the operation of this requires properly trained crews. It requires standard operating procedures that need to be aviation grade and then approved by the regulators. So we put that all in place. That was part of our product development efforts over the past 9 years since the company has been incorporated. So that goes all hand in hand with regulatory documentation and approvals, very, very similarly to manned aircraft as well.
Now, SwissDrones has just been granted European drone operator license, or has just been given a European drone operator license. You must be very, very pleased with that. But what does that actually mean for the company? How will that impact you guys?
What that means is that we are, and that's a slightly different regulatory framework under EASA rules in Europe than it is under FAA rules in the US. The EASA framework offers an option to obtain a so-called light unmanned certificate, which means you get the authority delegated to self-approve your operations beyond visual line of sight, even with large drones. It's the highest approval that you can get under the European drone regulation, under the EASA. It's only 6 companies, I believe, today that have obtained an LUC altogether. It's pretty much the equivalent of what an airline gets as an operator certificate, which is the so-called AOC. So the LUC copies that for the unmanned world. And that means, in fact, that we are now empowered to authorize our own flight operations beyond visual line of sight with our helicopters in all of the EASA countries, which is about 30 countries across Europe.
Wow, okay, so you've got the European regulatory body nailed down. What's next for SwissDrones?
Well, there's lots going on all over the place. We also do the same thing in other countries. So we're working on approvals in Australia, in Indonesia, and in other geographies. As said, in the US, we've been in that process for a long time by now, together with local partners in the US. And so this is all going in the same direction. So we need to get an operational readiness and approval from a regulatory point of view, so we can then start expanding these use cases and the actual application of these systems and solutions all over the place. So we're clearly focused on a global expansion and working across geographies.
Well, exciting times ahead for SwissDrones, Ulrich. But if people want to find out more about what you do, where can they get hold of you?
Our website, SwissDrones.com, would be a good starting point. We have quite a lot of video and other materials, of course, our solutions and products being presented there. And you will find the contact links as well. We do have LinkedIn profiles, so check that out. And if you're interested, follow us there. If anyone has a direct request to get in touch, feel free to do so. All the contact information is on LinkedIn and on our website as well.
Ulrich, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation. We'll have to get you back on the show in a few months and catch up with you and see what's new. But if you've enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe so you can be the very first to view all of our newer content. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on Drones for Good from Modus.